I am Claire, 33 years old, and my sister has always made it her life mission to steal every man I ever dated. So when I introduced her to my new boyfriend, a supposedly clueless and incredibly wealthy tech billionaire, I knew she would not be able to resist taking the bait. She had absolutely no idea he was actually the ruthless divorce attorney representing her soon-to-be ex-husband, and she certainly did not know she was about to hand him every single piece of evidence needed to send her and our parents to federal prison. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set a trap to expose a toxic family member. The plan officially began at an upscale steakhouse in Manhattan. The restaurant was loud, filled with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of wealthy patrons, but the tension at our table was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. I sat across from my parents Richard and Patricia and my younger sister Madison. Next to me sat Harrison. To my family, Harrison was a 36-year-old angel investor who had recently sold a tech startup for an obscene amount of money. In reality, he was one of the most feared divorce lawyers in the city. I had prepped him well. He wore a custom-tailored suit that screamed careless wealth and a vintage watch that caught the dim restaurant lighting perfectly. Madison locked her eyes on that watch the moment we sat down. At 30, Madison was the undeniable golden child of our family. She was beautiful, undeniably charming when she wanted to be, and completely ruthless. She was also in the middle of a very messy, very fraudulent divorce. Within exactly 15 minutes of our appetizers arriving, the show began. Madison leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, letting her designer neckline dip just enough to draw attention. She sighed heavily, putting on her best damsel in distress performance. She looked at Harrison with wide, teary eyes and began talking about how incredibly difficult her life was right now. She painted herself as the tragic victim of a cruel marriage, claiming she was just a fragile woman trying to navigate a terrifying legal system all by herself. My mother, Patricia, immediately jumped in to support her. Patricia reached across the table and patted Madison on the hand, looking at Harrison with a practiced look of maternal concern. She told him that Madison was just too trusting, too pure for this world, and that her husband had completely broken her spirit. My father Richard nodded along, taking a sip of his bourbon, and adding that they were doing everything they could to protect their little girl from financial ruin. I sat there in silence, playing my assigned role perfectly. In my family, I was just the boring number-crunching forensic accountant. I was the reliable but unexciting older sister who worked too many hours and never had any interesting stories to tell. I deliberately wore a plain gray blazer and kept my hair pulled back in a severe bun. I wanted to look as unremarkable as possible, the perfect contrast to Madison's sparkling tragic allure. Harrison played his part flawlessly. He leaned toward Madison, hanging on her every word. He offered sympathetic nods and asked gentle, validating questions about her situation. He told her how brave she was for facing such a difficult ordeal. He played the captivated wealthy Mark so well that I almost wanted to applaud him. Madison ate it up. Her sadness magically vanished, replaced by a radiant, predatory energy. She started laughing a little too loudly at his jokes. She completely ignored me, directing all her conversation to the supposedly wealthy man sitting beside me. This was her pattern. This was exactly what she did with my high school boyfriend, my college boyfriend, and the man I dated in my late 20s. If I had something, Madison had to take it just to prove she could. Halfway through the main course, I decided to test the waters. I reached for my water glass and deliberately fumbled, knocking my linen napkin off my lap. It fell to the floor, landing near Harrison's feet. I murmured an apology and ducked my head under the table to retrieve it. The sight under the table confirmed everything I needed to know. Madison had slipped her foot out of her expensive high heel. Her bare toes were slowly and deliberately tracing slow circles up and down Harrison's calf. She was rubbing her foot against his leg, bold and entirely unbothered by the fact that her parents were sitting inches away or that I, the supposed girlfriend, was sitting right next to him. I grabbed my napkin and sat back up, keeping my face completely blank. A normal person would have been devastated to catch their sister making a move on their partner. A normal person would have thrown a drink or caused a massive scene in the middle of the restaurant. But I felt absolutely no betrayal. Instead, a cold wave of satisfaction washed over me. I looked at Madison. She was smiling brightly at Harrison, completely unaware that she had just walked right into a steel trap. She thought she was stealing another prize from her boring older sister. She thought her charm had won over a billionaire who could fund her luxurious lifestyle once her divorce was finalized. My parents continued to dominate the conversation, hyping up Madison while completely ignoring my presence. Patricia subtly shifted the topic to ask Harrison about his investment portfolio, clearly trying to gauge exactly how much money he had. I could see the greed flashing in my father's eyes as Harrison casually mentioned a recent 9-figure acquisition deal. My mother practically shoved my sister closer to him, completely disregarding the fact that he was supposed to be my date. Richard chimed in, making a pointed comment about how important it is for successful men to have a supportive, beautiful woman by their side, looking directly at Madison as he said it. They were practically auctioning her off right in front of me. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the bitter taste. They thought they were so clever. They thought I was just collateral damage in their endless quest to give Madison everything she wanted. But they had severely underestimated the quiet, boring accountant. They had no idea that every sympathetic nod Harrison gave, every encouraging word he spoke, was a calculated maneuver to gather intelligence. Madison was weaponizing her charm to take what she thought was mine, but all she was really doing was handing the enemy the keys to her own destruction. The dinner continued, the deception deepened, and I just sat back and watched the golden child dig her own grave. The main course was cleared away, and the waiter brought the dessert menus. Madison was practically vibrating with adrenaline now. Her initial subtle foot-rubbing had escalated into full-blown overt flirtation. She kept tossing her hair back, laughing at every minor comment Harrison made and finding excuses to lean into his personal space. I watched her precision. It was almost clinical. She was a predator locking onto a target, and she did not care who she had to step on to get the kill. I took another slow sip of my water, waiting for her inevitable next move. I knew my sister. She needed an excuse to break the physical barrier, a reason to touch him where everyone could see. She reached across the table, her hand hovering over the delicate stem of her wine glass. With a sudden jerky movement that looked completely unnatural to anyone paying attention, she knocked the glass sideways. A wave of dark red wine cascaded directly onto Harrison's lap and the crisp white sleeve of his expensive tailored shirt. "Oh my goodness," Madison gasped, her voice pitched an octave higher than usual. "I am so incredibly sorry. I am so clumsy today." Before Harrison could even react, Madison was out of her seat. She grabbed her thick linen napkin and lunged toward him. She leaned in dangerously close, her expensive perfume suffocating the small space between them. She began dabbing aggressively at his chest, and then moved her hands down toward his lap, lingering entirely too long. It was a blatant, highly inappropriate display masquerading as an innocent apology. She was practically sitting on him in the middle of a crowded upscale restaurant. Harrison played his part like a seasoned actor. He gently caught her wrists, stopping her frantic dabbing with a warm, forgiving smile. "It is perfectly fine, Madison. Truly. It is just a shirt. Please do not worry about it." He was giving her exactly the reaction she desperately craved. He was playing the forgiving, captivated billionaire who found her clumsiness utterly charming. Madison gazed up at him through her eyelashes, her hands still resting intimately on his chest. I glanced across the table at my mother. A normal mother would have been absolutely mortified. A normal mother would have scolded her youngest daughter for practically throwing herself at her eldest daughter's boyfriend. But Patricia was not a normal mother. She clasped her well-manicured hands together and beamed at the scene unfolding before her. "Look how nurturing you are, Madison." Patricia cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You always take such good care of people. It is your best quality. You have such a truly big heart." I stared at my mother, letting a hard, visibly disgusted look settle on my face. Nurturing. That was the exact word Patricia chose to describe my sister attempting to seduce my supposed partner in public. The absolute audacity of the entire situation was staggering. They were not even trying to hide their agenda anymore. They saw a wealthy man, they saw a golden opportunity for their favorite child, and they were willing to steamroll right over me to make the perfect match happen. My glare did not go unnoticed. My father Richard caught my eye. His jovial smile instantly vanished, replaced by a harsh warning scowl. He set his napkin heavily on the table and stood up abruptly. Claire Richard set his tone, leaving absolutely no room for argument or discussion. "Come with me for a moment. I need to speak with you about a family matter outside." I did not argue. I stood up, smoothing down my gray blazer, and followed him away from the table. He did not lead me to the lobby. Instead, he steered me toward a dim, quiet hallway near the restrooms, far from the prying eyes of the restaurant staff. The moment we were out of sight, his hand shot out. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging sharply into my bicep. "What is wrong with you?" Richard hissed, his voice low and vibrating with intense anger. "Excuse me," I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the uncomfortable pressure on my arm. "Do not play dumb with me, Claire. I saw the way you were glaring at your sister. You are embarrassing us. You are sitting there looking like a miserable rain cloud while Madison is trying to make a genuine connection." "A connection," I repeated calmly. "She just poured wine on my boyfriend's lap so she could grope him at the dinner table." Richard tightened his grip. "Your sister is going through a devastating divorce, Claire. Let her have some fun. She has been incredibly depressed lately, and Harrison is the first thing that has made her smile in months." I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me. He was actively demanding that I hand over my partner to soothe his favorite daughter's fragile ego. "He is supposed to be my boyfriend, Dad," I said, playing my part, projecting a careful mix of hurt and frustration. Richard scoffed, rolling his eyes dismissively. "Oh, please. You brought him here, but Harrison clearly prefers her energy anyway. Any blind man could see that. He has barely looked at you since the appetizers arrived." "Do not be a stubborn brat. You know you are too focused on your spreadsheets to keep a man like that entertained. Let your sister handle this. She needs a win right now." The sheer cruelty of his words hung heavily in the narrow hallway. He was telling me directly to my face that I was inadequate, boring, and entirely disposable. He was telling me that my feelings were completely irrelevant compared to Madison's temporary amusement. This was the toxic family dynamic stripped bare. I was merely the stepping stone. Madison was always the final destination. A younger, more fragile version of myself would have shattered right there. I would have cried, argued, and begged for my father's basic respect. But the woman standing in that hallway was a forensic accountant who spent her days dismantling complex corporate fraud. I dealt in hard facts, undeniable evidence, and calculated execution. I swallowed the rising bile in my throat. I looked at my father's angry, expectant face. I took a deep breath and let a slow, dead-eyed smile stretch across my face. "You are right, Dad," I said, making my voice sound entirely defeated and compliant. "I am being selfish. She is going through a lot with David. I will let her have her fun. I will back off." Richard released my arm instantly. His demeanor flipped immediately back to the jovial, satisfied patriarch. He patted my shoulder heavily, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Good girl. I knew you would finally see reason. We have to look out for family Claire. That is what matters most." He turned and walked back toward the dining room, completely satisfied with his successful manipulation. I stood alone in the hallway for a few seconds longer. I smoothed the wrinkles from my sleeve exactly where he had grabbed me. The trap was now fully armed, and my family had just eagerly locked themselves inside it. They wanted Madison to have Harrison. They were entirely willing to trample me to make it happen. I smiled again, this time with genuine ice-cold anticipation. I walked back into the dining room, entirely ready to hand my sister exactly the rope she desperately needed to hang herself. I slid back into my chair next to Harrison. The spilled wine had been covered by a fresh cloth, and the waiter was pouring a new glass for my sister. Madison was leaning across the table again, her voice lowered into a conspiratorial, fragile register. She was completely engrossed in explaining the tragedy of her marriage to my fake boyfriend. I picked up my fork and focused on my steak, letting the rapid, venomous dialogue wash over me. "It has just been a nightmare. Harrison. Madison sighed, pressing a hand to her chest. I gave David the best years of my life, and he completely shattered my mental health. He is so controlling, so incredibly difficult to be around. My mother. Patricia chimed in immediately, her tone laced with that quiet, deeply ingrained prejudice she usually reserved for closed doors and hushed conversations. We warned her. Of course, Patricia said, taking a delicate sip of her wine. David comes from a very different background than we do. We tried to be open-minded. We really did. But you simply cannot teach class Harrison. You can put a man in a tailored suit, but you cannot change his fundamental nature or where he comes from. David was 35 years old, a brilliant and highly successful African-American real estate developer. He had built his empire entirely from scratch, earning every single dollar through sheer grit, unmatched intelligence, and late nights at his architectural firm. He was also the only person in this family who had ever treated me with genuine respect. Richard and Patricia had never truly accepted him. They tolerated his presence at holiday dinners exclusively because his massive net worth elevated their own social standing among their elite friends. Behind his back, they made endless passive-aggressive comments about his culture, his family, and his tone. They whispered about how he did not belong in their circles, how his wealth was an anomaly rather than a testament to his hard work. He is aggressive, Richard added, cutting into his meat with unnecessary force. He is always raising his voice, always trying to dominate the room with his physical presence. It is intimidating, frankly. Madison was walking on eggshells in her own home. The emotional abuse was staggering. I told her she had to get out before he did something worse. A man like that is unpredictable, and we could not risk her safety any longer. I chewed my food slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on my plate to hide the sheer disgust boiling in my chest. David had never raised his voice at Madison in his life. If anything, he had spent the last 5 years bending over backward to accommodate her endless narcissistic demands. He had bought her designer cars, funded her luxury vacations, and endured my parents' thinly veiled racism with absolute grace. He was a gentle, patient man who had been pushed to his absolute breaking point by a family of ruthless leeches. I am just trying to get what is fair, Madison said, fluttering her eyelashes at Harrison and reaching for her freshly poured wine. My lawyer is demanding 80% of his assets. It is the absolute minimum I deserve for the emotional trauma and the sheer terror I endured during our marriage. I have severe anxiety from dealing with his unpredictable temper. Harrison raised an eyebrow, perfectly playing the part of an impressed, supportive confidant. 80%. That is a bold strategy, Madison. Your legal counsel must be very confident in your claims of abuse to go after such a large portion of a self-made estate. Oh, we are very confident. Madison beamed, completely missing the calculating, predatory gleam in Harrison's eyes. I am getting the 2 luxury apartment complexes he just finished developing downtown, plus $5 million in liquid cash. It is only right. I supported him while he built those properties. I stood by him when no one else would. He owes me my share for being a supportive, loyal wife. Supported him. The word echoed in my mind like a bad joke. Madison had not worked a single day since she married David. She spent her days at the country club getting expensive spa treatments, and her evenings draining his business credit cards on designer handbags and shoes. Now she was actively utilizing false claims of emotional abuse to extort a decent, hardworking man for everything he had built. She was trying to strip him bare, leaving him with nothing, and my parents were eagerly cheering her on from the sidelines, hoping to catch some of the financial fallout. Harrison leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink thoughtfully. Well, Madison, any man who would treat a woman like you poorly certainly deserves to lose his empire. It sounds like he took advantage of your trusting nature. I hope your legal team takes him for every single penny he has. Madison giggled, entirely captivated by the handsome billionaire validating her greed. They will. David does not stand a chance against my lawyers. He is going to lose absolutely everything. Beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, I slipped my phone out of my pocket. I kept my face perfectly blank, looking like a bored, disconnected sister who had entirely checked out of the conversation. My fingers moved quickly across the screen, hidden from the view of my gloating family. I opened my hidden encrypted messaging app and pulled up David's contact. I typed a swift, concise message, making sure my screen brightness was turned all the way down so the glow would not reflect on my clothes. She took the bait. The parents are backing her. I hit send and slipped the phone back into my pocket before anyone could notice my brief distraction. The first phase of the operation was officially a resounding success. Madison had absolutely no idea that the sympathetic wealthy billionaire sitting across from her nodding at her every lie was currently memorizing every single detail of her extortion strategy. She was proudly outlining her entire fraudulent playbook, handing over the very ammunition we needed to destroy her case in court. And my parents, blinded by their own prejudice and insatiable greed, were helping her dig the grave deeper with every word they spoke. The very next morning began with aggressive pounding on my apartment door. I was sipping coffee and reviewing audio transcripts from the dinner when the sound shattered my quiet Saturday. I glanced at the monitor. It was my parents. Richard and Patricia stood in the hallway looking frantic. They were not there for a friendly visit. I locked my laptop screen and unlocked the door. Before I could offer a greeting, Richard pushed past me, shoving me aside to enter my living room. Patricia followed, clutching a manila folder against her chest. She looked around my modest apartment with her usual mild distaste before locking her eyes on me. "Lock the door, Claire," my father barked, tossing his coat over my sofa. "We do not have time for pleasantries today. We have a family emergency, and we need your skill set immediately." I turned to face them. "What kind of emergency?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Did Madison finally realize she embarrassed herself last night?" "Do not be petty right now," Patricia snapped, dropping the manila folder onto my kitchen counter with a thud. "This is not about some harmless flirting. This is about your sister and her financial safety. We need you to do your job." "My job is forensic accounting," I reminded her calmly. "I uncover financial fraud for corporate clients. I do not do taxes for family members." "You are going to do this," Richard said, stepping closer and invading my personal space. Madison made a move to protect herself financially, and now David has hired a vicious legal team to look into his accounts. They are trying to leave her with nothing. "We need you to adjust her financial documents before the mediation next week." I looked at the folder, then up at my angry father. "Adjust her documents," I repeated. "Dad, are you asking me to falsify financial records? What exactly did Madison do?" Patricia sighed heavily. "She did what she had to do. Claire, over the last 6 months, Madison slowly transferred $1.5 million out of David's primary accounts. She moved the money to secure her own independence because she knew he would try to starve her during the divorce." I stared at them, genuinely impressed by the sheer scale of the audacity. $1.5 million. Madison had not just drained his personal credit cards. She had actively embezzled a massive sum of capital from his real estate business. That was a direct, irrefutable federal crime. And now my parents were standing in my kitchen, aggressively demanding that I become a willing accessory to corporate embezzlement. "She stole $1.5 million from his business," I stated flatly, ensuring the reality of their request hung clearly in the air. "She did not steal it," Richard yelled, his face turning red. "It is marital property." "But his lawyers will claim she siphoned company funds, putting her in severe legal jeopardy. You are an accountant. You know exactly how to bury a money trail. Create dummy invoices, shift offshore routing numbers, and make cash disappear. We need you to fix the numbers so his lawyers cannot trace the cash." I crossed my arms, maintaining a mask of reluctant hesitation. "Dad, what you are asking me to do is a major felony. If I alter these documents and get caught, I will lose my CPA license forever. I could go to federal prison. I am not risking my entire career and my freedom because Madison decided to embezzle money from her husband." My father's eyes narrowed into cold, unforgiving slits. The jovial patriarch from the restaurant was completely gone, replaced by a ruthless tyrant who would destroy anyone standing in the way of his golden child. He stepped even closer. "Let me make this perfectly clear for you, Claire," Richard said, his voice dripping with venom. "You are going to fix these documents today. If you refuse to help your own blood, if you turn your back on your sister when she needs you the most, you are completely done in this family. I will cut you out of the family trust entirely. You will not see a single dime of your inheritance. You will be absolutely dead to us. Do you understand? Fix the numbers or you have no family. The threat hung heavily in the quiet apartment. He was leveraging my inheritance and my position in the family, entirely confident that those things meant enough to me that I would gladly commit a federal felony to secure them. He thought I was weak. He thought I was still desperate. I looked at Patricia. She stood there silently, perfectly willing to sacrifice her eldest daughter to save her youngest. I let the silence stretch out, putting on a flawless performance of a terrified daughter, weighing her morals against the crushing weight of her father's rejection. In reality, my heart was racing with unadulterated triumph. They had just hand-delivered the exact physical evidence I needed to completely destroy them. "Fine," I whispered, keeping my voice shaky. "I will do it. I will look at the files." Richard smiled a smug, victorious sneer. "I knew you would not let us down, Claire. We are family. Family always protects each other." Patricia patted my cheek, her touch feeling like cold ice. "Just make the money disappear, darling. We knew we could count on your boring numbers job eventually." They turned and walked out of my apartment, leaving the heavy manila folder resting ominously on my kitchen counter. As the heavy door clicked shut behind them, I walked over to the folder. I opened the thick cover and stared at the documents inside. There they were. The bank statements, the unauthorized transfer slips, the routing numbers to an offshore account, and a series of forged signatures. It was an absolute goldmine of criminal evidence. I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photographs of every single page. I smiled a cold, genuine smile. I was going to adjust the numbers exactly like they asked. I was going to adjust them right into a perfectly categorized, undeniable exhibit for the federal prosecutor. I packed the original documents back into the heavy manila folder and slipped it into my leather briefcase. Leaving my apartment, I hailed a cab and headed straight to the financial district. The sleek glass exterior of David's architectural firm stood tall against the Manhattan skyline, a physical monument to his relentless work ethic. I walked through the revolving doors and crossed the expansive marble lobby. The receptionist recognized me instantly, giving a warm smile and a slight nod of acknowledgement. I did not bother stopping at her desk or waiting for an announcement. I walked straight down the main corridor past the glass-walled conference rooms where junior architects were reviewing designs and pushed open the heavy oak door leading directly to David's private office. David sat behind a massive drafting table surrounded by rolled blueprints and scattered financial ledgers. He looked utterly exhausted. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and the sheer weight of the last 6 months of Madison's psychological warfare was etched deeply into his posture. His usually immaculate suit jacket was draped over a chair, and his sleeves were rolled up past his elbows. But despite the overwhelming fatigue, his eyes were sharp and fiercely determined. He looked up as I closed the heavy door behind me and immediately locked the deadbolt. "Did she take the bait?" David asked, his voice rough but steady. "She practically swallowed the hook." I replied, walking over to his desk and setting my briefcase down on the polished wood. "My parents are completely blinded by the dollar signs. They actually told me I was embarrassing the family by not letting Madison seduce my own boyfriend. They actively encouraged her to throw herself at him in the middle of a crowded restaurant." David let out a harsh, humorless laugh, rubbing his temples with his fingertips. "That sounds exactly like Richard and Patricia. Madison wants to destroy my entire life, and they are eagerly holding the matches for her. They have always thought the rules simply do not apply to them." Before we could analyze the dinner any further, the secondary door connected to the private executive elevator clicked open. Harrison walked into the room. The transformation was instantaneous and completely remarkable. The goofy, captivated billionaire persona he had worn at the steakhouse vanished completely. He pulled off his expensive suit jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a leather armchair, and aggressively loosened his vintage silk tie. His posture shifted from relaxed and clueless to the rigid, imposing stance of a legal predator. He tossed a yellow legal pad onto David's desk, the pages entirely filled with cramped, aggressive handwriting and legal strategies. Harrison was not an angel investor. He was the most ruthless lead divorce counsel in the state, and more importantly, he had been David's fiercely loyal best friend since their very first year of law school. They had shared a cramped dorm room, studied for the bar exam together, and built their respective empires side by side. When Madison filed her fraudulent extortion claims and demanded an absurd settlement, David did not even have to make a phone call. Harrison had simply shown up at this office with a legal pad and a declaration of war against my sister. "Your sister is an absolute piece of work," Claire Harrison said, pouring himself a glass of icy water from the crystal carafe on the desk. She spilled red wine on my favorite shirt, just so she could grope me in front of her parents. The entire family is completely unhinged. I have dealt with incredibly narcissistic spouses before, but Madison is operating on an entirely different level of delusion and arrogance. "I warned you," David said, leaning back in his leather chair. "She will cross any line to get what she wants, and Richard will gladly fund the bulldozer. They think they can bleed me dry because they have always gotten away with treating people like garbage. They look at me and just see a bank account they can empty." "They are not getting away with anything this time," I said firmly. I unlatched the brass clasps of my briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder my parents had dropped off just an hour ago. I slid it across the polished wood of David's desk, pushing it right in front of Harrison. "Harrison, you are going to absolutely love this. My father explicitly demanded that I alter Madison's financial documents to hide her massive theft. They want me to bury the money trail so your investigative team cannot find the missing capital." Harrison stopped drinking immediately. He set his glass down slowly, his sharp eyes locking onto the unassuming folder. He stepped forward, picked it up, and flipped the heavy cover open. The silence in the spacious office was absolute as his eyes rapidly scanned the bank statements, the unauthorized wire transfer slips, and the offshore routing numbers. When he reached the back pages and saw the forged authorization signatures, a slow, incredibly dangerous smile spread across his face. "This is unbelievable," Harrison whispered, sounding almost in awe of their sheer stupidity. "She actually set up a complex shell company in the Cayman Islands, and Richard literally forged the authorization signatures to bypass the bank security protocols. They handed this directly to you. They literally delivered the murder weapon straight to the crime scene." "They think I am weak," I explained quietly, watching the satisfaction wash over David's face. "They think I am so desperate for their basic approval and my share of the family trust that I would gladly commit a federal felony just to stay in their good graces. My father threatened to cut me out of the family entirely if I did not fix the numbers before the mediation next week." David stood up, his exhaustion suddenly replaced by a massive surge of pure adrenaline. He looked down at the forged signatures, his jaw tightening with renewed anger. $1.5 million. She drained my primary operating accounts while I was out of town securing the new commercial zoning permits. She intentionally tried to bankrupt my firm so I could not afford to fight her in court. "And now we have the undeniable physical proof of her crime," Harrison said, tapping the folder aggressively with his expensive pen. "But physical proof is only half the legal battle. If we bring this to the judge right now, Madison will just play the victim again. She will claim she had no idea what she was signing. She will immediately throw your father under the bus and say Richard handled all her complex finances because she was too stressed from the divorce. We need her to explicitly admit she knew about the theft. We need her to confess to the malicious intent on crystal-clear audio." "That is exactly why the billionaire persona needs to stay intact," I said, looking directly at Harrison. "She thinks you are her golden ticket to a life of limitless luxury. She thinks you are completely captivated by her tragic victim routine. We need to give her a concrete reason to brag. We need to trigger her narcissism so deeply that she absolutely cannot resist showing off how ruthless and clever she thinks she is." Harrison nodded slowly, his brilliant legal mind already racing several steps ahead of the current situation. "If she thinks I am a ruthless shark in the business world, she will desperately want to prove she is a shark too. We just need to set the perfect trap to make her voluntarily open her mouth and confess to everything." "We finalized the bait today," David said, his voice incredibly cold and entirely resolute. "We give her exactly enough rope to hang herself with, and then we pull the floor out from under her. Absolutely no mercy. Not after what they tried to do to my business, my reputation, and my children. No mercy, I agreed, feeling a profound sense of closure already beginning to form. The three of us sat down around the heavy oak desk, entirely united in our singular purpose. My family thought they were playing a brilliant, unstoppable game of chess, completely unaware that we had already flipped the entire board upside down. The counter-conspiracy was officially locked in place, and Madison was about to walk blindly into a financial and legal slaughterhouse that she would never be able to escape. We needed a bait so shiny and expensive that Madison would completely abandon caution. Harrison laid out the psychological warfare we were about to wage. He detailed the strategy. He would send an obnoxiously large bouquet of rare white orchids to my accounting firm the next morning. But the flowers were just the distraction. The real trap was the digital receipt. Harrison explained that his assistant would deliberately send the billing confirmation to Madison's email address, accompanied by a polite apology for the administrative mix-up, claiming they had confused the contact information for Claire's sister. Attached to that email would be a meticulously fabricated invoice. It would not just show the $300 charge for the orchids. It would also display a secondary, much more interesting recent purchase, a $50,000 vintage Rolex watch. Madison is incredibly predictable, David said. She equates love entirely with financial expenditure. The moment she sees a receipt for a $50,000 watch, she will assume Harrison is preparing to shower you with extreme luxury. She will not be able to stand the thought of you getting a prize that massive while she is fighting for scraps in mediation. She will absolutely lose her mind, I agreed. She will view that Rolex as a direct challenge. She will realize she needs to lock Harrison down immediately. The next morning played out exactly according to Harrison's calculated script. I was sitting at my desk at the firm reviewing a genuine corporate audit when a delivery man struggled through the glass doors, holding a massive, cascading arrangement of rare white orchids. They were stunning, expensive, and completely over the top. My coworkers gasped and whispered, asking who the incredibly generous sender was. I simply smiled, signed for the delivery, and placed the massive arrangement squarely on the corner of my desk. At that exact moment across town, the trap snapped shut. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Harrison. The bait has been delivered to her inbox. Let us see how long it takes for her to make a desperate move. I did not have to wait long. I finished my workday, packed my briefcase, and took a cab back to my apartment. I had deliberately left my personal iPad charging on the kitchen island. It was completely unlocked. This was highly uncharacteristic for a security-conscious forensic accountant, but it was absolutely essential for the trap to work smoothly. Barely 20 minutes after I walked through my front door and changed into comfortable clothes, the intercom buzzed loudly. I checked the screen. It was Madison. She was standing in the lobby wearing a designer trench coat, looking agitated and entirely desperate. I buzzed her up, unlocking the apartment door and leaving it slightly ajar. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a large mug of black coffee, and leaned against the counter, perfectly positioned in the shadows of the hallway, where I could see the living room without being easily spotted. Madison pushed the door open and burst into the apartment. She did not bother knocking. She looked around frantically, her eyes darting across the room. "Claire," she called out, her voice tight and high-pitched. "Are you here? Mom asked me to drop off some mail that went to the house." It was a weak, pathetic excuse. I did not answer. I stood completely still in the dim kitchen, gripping my warm coffee mug, and watched my sister operate. When I did not respond, Madison dropped the pretense instantly. She stopped looking for me and immediately locked her eyes on the kitchen island. She saw my unlocked iPad resting right next to a stack of mail. She moved toward it with predatory swiftness. I watched in absolute silence as she reached out and tapped the screen. The device woke up instantly. Madison did not hesitate. She bypassed my email and went straight for my contacts application. Her manicured fingers flew across the glass screen, typing Harrison's name into the search bar. She was committing a crime right in my kitchen. Accessing a digital device without authorization to steal personal data was a clear violation of privacy laws. But she did not care. She was completely consumed by the vision of a $50,000 Rolex and the desperate need to steal the man who could buy it for her. I took a slow, silent sip of my coffee. The bitter liquid matched the cold reality of the situation perfectly. My sister was a thief. She was stealing money from her husband, and now she was stealing personal data from me. Madison found his contact card. She quickly pulled her own cell phone from her designer handbag and furiously typed Harrison's private direct phone number into her device. She hit save, a massive smile of triumph flashing across her face. She thought she had just secured the golden key to an endless fortune. She quickly tapped the power button on my iPad, turning the screen black and setting it exactly where she had found it. She smoothed down her trench coat, took a deep breath to compose herself, and turned toward the hallway. I stepped out of the shadows, holding my coffee mug casually. "Oh," I said, keeping my voice mild and slightly surprised. "Madison, I did not hear you come in." Madison jumped, her hand flying to her chest in shock. She quickly shoved her phone deep into her coat pocket, plastering a fake sweet smile onto her face. "Claire," she gasped. "You scared me. I was just dropping off some mail from Mom." I called out, but you did not answer. "I must have been in the bedroom." I lied smoothly, walking over to the island and picking up the mail she had tossed down. "Thank you for bringing this over. Is everything okay?" "You seem flushed." Madison waved her hand dismissively, her eyes practically gleaming with stolen victory. "Everything is absolutely perfect, Claire. I actually cannot stay. I just remembered I have a very important appointment I need to get ready for." "An appointment?" I asked, feigning polite curiosity. "With your lawyers?" "Something like that," Madison said, already backing toward the front door. "I will talk to you later, Claire. Have a boring night with your spreadsheets." She practically sprinted out the door, desperate to start plotting her next move. As the door clicked shut behind her, I set my coffee mug down on the counter. I picked up my iPad and opened the security application I had installed specifically for this afternoon. The screen displayed a clear, high-definition video recording from the front-facing camera. It perfectly captured Madison's face, her eager expression, and her exact finger movements as she illegally accessed my contacts and stole Harrison's private number. I exported the video file and sent it directly to David and Harrison in our secure group chat. "The bait was taken," I typed out quickly. "The target is locked." Harrison replied less than a minute later. "Perfect. Now we give her the opportunity to strike." The trap was officially armed. Madison thought she was the master manipulator, silently stealing her way to victory. She had absolutely no idea she was dancing perfectly to the exact tune we had written for her, and the final curtain call was going to be absolutely devastating. The very next afternoon, I invited my parents and sister over for a quick lunch, claiming I had leftover catering from a firm event to get rid of. My family never turned down free food. As they sat around my dining table picking at artisan sandwiches and complaining about city traffic, I deliberately pulled my sleek black carry-on suitcase from the hall closet and dragged it into the center of the living room. I opened it and began methodically packing tailored blouses, slacks, and sensible heels. Madison watched me closely from the kitchen island. "Are you going somewhere?" she asked, her voice laced with sudden curiosity. I sighed heavily, putting on my best performance of an exhausted corporate drone. "Yes," I replied, folding a blazer. "The partners at my firm just dumped a massive emergency project onto my desk this morning. A major client in Chicago is facing a sudden federal investigation regarding their quarterly earnings, and they need a senior forensic auditor on site immediately to review their physical ledgers. I have a mandatory flight out of LaGuardia in exactly 3 hours. I am going to be stuck in a miserable, windowless conference room in Illinois for the next 3 days." I caught the exact moment my sister realized the golden opportunity sitting right in front of her. Her eyes widened slightly, and a sudden electric energy radiated from her posture. She quickly masked it by taking a sip of sparkling water, but the predatory glint in her eyes was unmistakable. My mother, Patricia, did not bother trying to hide her sheer delight. She set her plate down, practically beaming at the heavy suitcase resting on my rug. "Oh, Claire," she said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy that barely concealed her thrill. "That is such a terrible shame for you, working all weekend in a freezing city like Chicago. But I suppose that is what happens when you prioritize climbing the corporate ladder over building a personal life. You have always been devoted to your spreadsheets. You should absolutely go and focus entirely on your job. Do not worry about us or Harrison. We will make sure he is entertained while you are gone. I zipped the suitcase closed and stood up. I am sure you will, Mom, I said, maintaining a flat expression. I grabbed my thick winter coat and my leather briefcase. Patricia practically leaped out of her chair to usher me toward the front door. She grabbed my arm, her fingers squeezing with eager anticipation. You really must hurry, darling, she insisted, pushing me gently but firmly toward the hallway. You cannot risk missing your flight, especially for something so critical to your career. We will let ourselves out. Just have a safe trip, and please turn your phone off so you can really focus on your numbers. She was practically shoving me out of my own apartment, utterly desperate to get me out of the way so Madison could make her move. I stepped out into the hallway, pulling my luggage behind me. Goodbye, I called out. I will see you all when I get back on Wednesday. The heavy door clicked shut, severing me from their toxic energy. I did not head to the airport. I took the elevator down to the lobby, dragged my suitcase out to the sidewalk, and hailed a yellow cab. I gave the driver the address for David's private residence in Brooklyn, leaning back against the worn leather seat with a deep exhale of relief. The physical separation was the final piece of the setup. Back in my apartment, the moment they heard the elevator ding, Madison wasted absolutely no time. According to the hidden security camera I had left running in the kitchen, she did not even wait for our parents to leave. She practically ran to the guest bathroom, locked the door, and pulled out her cell phone. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she pulled up the private number she had illegally stolen from my iPad just 24 hours prior. She typed out a carefully crafted, highly manipulative message designed specifically to hook a wealthy businessman who thought she was a tragic victim. She hit send, completely convinced that she was orchestrating a brilliant secret romance behind her boring sister's back. 30 minutes later, I walked through the front door of David's sprawling townhouse. David was sitting at his massive kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee, reviewing a stack of custody documents. Harrison was lounging on the leather sofa in the living room, his laptop open on his knees, casually reviewing legal precedents for the upcoming mediation. As I walked into the room, Harrison's phone buzzed loudly on the glass coffee table. He picked it up, unlocked the screen, and let out a sharp, amused laugh. Right on schedule, Harrison announced, holding the phone up so David and I could see the screen. It is your lovely sister. Read it, David said, a grim smile forming on his face. Harrison cleared his throat and read the text aloud. Hi, Harrison. It is Madison. I am so sorry to bother you on a weekend, but I am dealing with some complex financial issues regarding my divorce. My lawyers are confusing me, and I desperately need some strong business advice from a successful man who actually understands these things. Claire mentioned she had to fly to Chicago, so I know you must be alone today. I would love to buy you a private drink and pick your brain. Meet me at the boutique hotel lounge downtown at 7 tonight. Just the two of us. It was perfectly orchestrated manipulation. I smiled, taking a seat next to David. Tell her you will be there, I said. Harrison typed out a swift reply. I would be honored to assist you, Madison. I will see you at 7. He locked his cell phone and tossed it onto the table. The final act was officially underway. Before Harrison left David's townhouse, we had to ensure every technical detail was flawless. David called in his private investigator, a former federal agent who dealt exclusively in high-stakes corporate espionage. He arrived within the hour carrying a sleek silver briefcase. He fitted Harrison with a military-grade audio recording device. The microphone was incredibly discreet, woven directly into the fabric of Harrison's custom silk tie, with the primary receiver securely taped against his ribs. It would pick up a whisper in a hurricane. We tested the audio feed 3 times. I sat at David's kitchen island wearing headphones, listening as Harrison whispered from the opposite end of the house. The sound was crystal clear. Harrison buttoned his charcoal suit jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and gave us a sharp nod. He was ready to go hunting. The boutique hotel lounge downtown was the perfect hunting ground for someone like my sister. It was aggressively expensive, bathed in dim amber lighting, and filled with plush velvet booths, designed to create the illusion of intense privacy. When Harrison walked through the heavy glass doors at exactly 7 o'clock, Madison was already waiting. She was sitting at a corner table near the back, perfectly illuminated by a small, flickering candle. She had clearly spent the entire afternoon preparing for this precise moment. She was wearing a deep crimson cocktail dress that was completely inappropriate for a casual drink, but perfectly designed to capture the attention of a wealthy target. Her hair was meticulously styled, and she had ordered a bottle of vintage champagne before Harrison even arrived, putting it on his tab naturally. Harrison approached the table with his signature billionaire smile, projecting an aura of relaxed authority. Madison practically glowed as he slid into the velvet booth across from her. She reached across the small table, letting her manicured fingers graze his hand as she thanked him for coming on such short notice. Harrison played the gracious gentleman, pouring them both a glass of champagne and leaning back, inviting her to speak. He asked her how she was holding up while her sister was stuck in a freezing conference room in Chicago. That was all it took. The mention of my name was the absolute green light Madison needed to start tearing me down. "Oh, let us not talk about Claire tonight," Madison sighed, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. "I love my sister, I really do, but she is just such a boring spinster. She has absolutely no passion for life. All she cares about are her spreadsheets and her little numbers. It is honestly pathetic. She has always been so plain, so terrified of taking risks. I always felt sorry for whoever ended up dating her because she simply does not know how to keep a man entertained or satisfied. She lacks that fundamental fire. You know what I mean, right, Harrison? You are a man who builds empires. You need a woman with ambition, a woman who understands luxury and knows how to operate in your world. Claire could never fit into a circle like yours. She would just embarrass you entirely." I was sitting back in David's living room, staring at the ceiling, listening to every single vicious word through the live audio feed. David looked at me with deep sympathy, but I just waved him off. Her insults did not hurt me. They were exactly what I needed her to say. She was establishing her motive. Harrison nodded along in the lounge, acting as though her cruel assessment was a profound revelation. He validated her, telling her he completely understood the burden of being surrounded by people who lacked true vision. Encouraged by his apparent agreement, Madison leaned further across the table. Her voice dropped into a low, intimate register. "That is exactly why I reached out to you, Harrison. I knew you would understand. I am dealing with these aggressive divorce lawyers, and they treat me like I am just some clueless housewife. My soon-to-be ex-husband. David thinks he holds all the cards just because he runs a real estate firm. He thinks I am entirely ignorant about how the real world works. But I am not, my sister. I am not some passive girl who just accepts what she is given. I know how to play the game, and I know how to win. I just need a little guidance from someone who operates at the absolute highest level. Someone like you." Harrison set his champagne flute down, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at her with a perfectly calibrated mixture of intrigue and subtle skepticism. "Winning is a very dangerous game, Madison, especially when you are dealing with a self-made developer like David. From what I understand, he has an incredibly tight grip on his assets. It takes a very specific, highly strategic kind of mind to outsmart a man like that in a high-stakes divorce. Are you sure you are ruthless enough to handle that kind of financial warfare? Most people simply do not have the stomach for it." The subtle challenge in his voice was the ultimate trigger. Madison's ego flared instantly. She could not stand the idea of Harrison doubting her intelligence or her ruthlessness. She needed to prove she was his equal. She needed to prove she was a financial shark capable of swimming in his wealthy waters. She scoffed, a confident, predatory smile spreading across her perfectly painted lips. "You seriously underestimate me, Harrison." David thought he had a tight grip on his assets, too. He thought he was untouchable because he built that firm from the ground up. He spent all his time at construction sites and architecture meetings, entirely convinced that I was just sitting at home planning spa days. He genuinely believed I was oblivious to his financial structures. But I was watching everything. I learned exactly how he moved capital between his limited liability companies. I know exactly how he structured his holding corporations. When I realized the marriage was over, I did not just sit around crying and waiting for a judge to hand me a standard alimony check. I took absolute control of the situation. I outsmarted him in his own game right under his nose, and he was completely blind to it. While he was out surveying new commercial properties and shaking hands with city planners, I was securing my own future. I realized very early on that if I wanted to survive a divorce with the lifestyle I deserved, I had to act preemptively. So I did exactly what a ruthless business owner would do. I leveled the playing field before he even knew we were playing a game. Harrison raised his glass, holding the champagne up to the candlelight, letting a look of genuine disbelief wash over his face. "You leveled the playing field," he repeated, his tone laced with heavy skepticism. "Madison, that is a dramatic claim. Moving capital away from a self-made real estate developer is not like hiding a credit card bill. Men like David have strict accounting protocols. They have financial safeguards and automated alerts for transactions. I respect your ambition truly, but I find it incredibly hard to believe a woman with no formal background in corporate finance managed to bypass an entire firm's security structure without triggering an audit. You are lovely, but moving money requires tactical expertise." The skepticism was the perfect catalyst. Madison bristled, her posture stiffening. She slammed her champagne flute onto the table, the noise cutting through the quiet hum of the lounge. She hated being underestimated, especially by a man she was actively trying to impress. Her eyes flashed with arrogance and desperate pride. "You think I do not have tactical expertise?" Madison challenged, leaning across the table until she was practically whispering into the microphone hidden in his tie. "You think I am just some pretty face who got lucky? Let me tell you how wrong you are, Harrison. I did not just hide a few $1,000s. I orchestrated a complete offshore diversion of his liquid assets. I went online and set up an untraceable shell company in the Cayman Islands. I registered it under a variation of a vendor name his development firm regularly uses for overseas imports. It was absolutely brilliant." Harrison widened his eyes, mimicking a man deeply impressed and slightly intimidated. "A shell company in the Cayman Islands," he echoed softly. "That is genuinely remarkable. But setting up the entity is only the first step. You still have to move the capital without his corporate banking division freezing the transfer. How much did you actually secure before he caught on?" "He never caught on." Madison laughed, a harsh, triumphant sound echoing through our earpieces back at the townhouse. "I funneled $1.5 million straight out of his primary operating accounts over 6 months. I did it in staggered increments so it would blend with his massive outgoing expenses for the new downtown complex. By the time his accountants realized there was a discrepancy in the reports, the money was completely gone, secured in an offshore account his lawyers will never touch. I stripped him of his working capital right before he needed it most." I sat rigidly on David's sofa, listening to her explicit confession of wire fraud and grand larceny. The audio was pristine. Every syllable was perfectly preserved. David clenched his fists, his jaw tight, as he heard his wife brag about attempting to bankrupt his life work. Harrison shook his head in mock amazement. $1.5 million, he said, letting a low whistle escape his lips. "Madison, I have to admit I am completely blown away. That takes incredible nerve. But there is still one thing I do not understand. His bank would never process staggered outgoing wire transfers of that magnitude without authorized physical signatures from the primary account holder. You could not just request those transfers online. They require verified documentation. How did you bypass the signature verification protocol without his legal team flagging it?" "That is where family loyalty comes in," Madison said, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "I knew I could not forge his signature myself. David knows my handwriting, and the bank tellers might have recognized the discrepancy, so I went to my father. Richard spent years reviewing David architectural contracts. He knows his signature perfectly. My father sat down at his desk, took a specialized drafting pen, and flawlessly forged David's signature on every single one of the authorizations. He practiced for hours until it was an exact match. The bank processed the paperwork immediately. She had just implicated our father in federal forgery." Harrison leaned forward, keeping his voice steady and encouraging. "Richard forged the documents. That is incredibly risky. But banks still require notarized verification for transfers exceeding a certain threshold. A forged signature is one thing, but a missing notary seal halts the process. Madison burst into genuine laughter, finding the situation absolutely hilarious. "Oh, Harrison, do you really think we would overlook something that basic? My mother is a licensed notary public." Patricia took the forged authorization forms, stamped them with her official state seal, and deliberately backdated the entries in her ledger to make it look like David signed them months prior in her presence. It was a complete family operation. They knew David was trying to leave me with nothing, so they did what they had to do to protect my future. We outsmarted his entire legal division. I have $1.5 million waiting for me, and David is walking away completely ruined. The silence following her confession was heavy and absolute. In the lounge, Harrison simply stared at her, his expression a masterpiece of calculated awe. Back in the townhouse, David and I shared a look of pure victory. We had the entire criminal conspiracy detailed on tape directly from the primary orchestrator. We had the motive, the method, and the explicit admission of complicity from both parents. Harrison broke the silence, raising his glass one last time. "Madison," he said softly, "you are truly something else. I promise you this divorce mediation is going to be an experience you will never forget." Madison beamed, convinced she had secured the ultimate prize. She clinked her glass against his, completely oblivious that she had just permanently sealed her own fate and handed us the exact weapon we needed to destroy her. Harrison raised his glass, holding the champagne up to the candlelight, letting a look of genuine disbelief wash over his face. "You leveled the playing field." He repeated, his tone laced with heavy skepticism. "Madison, that is a dramatic claim. Moving capital away from a self-made real estate developer is not like hiding a credit card bill. Men like David have strict accounting protocols. They have financial safeguards and automated alerts for transactions. I respect your ambition truly, but I find it incredibly hard to believe a woman with no formal background in corporate finance managed to bypass an entire firm's security structure without triggering an audit. You are lovely, but moving money requires tactical expertise." The skepticism was the perfect catalyst. Madison bristled, her posture stiffening. She slammed her champagne flute onto the table, the noise cutting through the quiet hum of the lounge. She hated being underestimated, especially by a man she was actively trying to impress. Her eyes flashed with arrogance and desperate pride. "You think I do not have tactical expertise?" Madison challenged, leaning across the table until she was practically whispering into the microphone hidden in his tie. "You think I am just some pretty face who got lucky? Let me tell you how wrong you are, Harrison. I did not just hide a few $1,000s. I orchestrated a complete offshore diversion of his liquid assets. I went online and set up an untraceable shell company in the Cayman Islands. I registered it under a variation of a vendor name his development firm regularly uses for overseas imports. It was absolutely brilliant." Harrison widened his eyes, mimicking a man deeply impressed and slightly intimidated. "A shell company in the Cayman Islands," he echoed softly. "That is genuinely remarkable. But setting up the entity is only the first step. You still have to move the capital without his corporate banking division freezing the transfer. How much did you actually secure before he caught on?" "He never caught on." Madison laughed, a harsh, triumphant sound echoing through our earpieces back at the townhouse. "I funneled $1.5 million straight out of his primary operating accounts over 6 months. I did it in staggered increments so it would blend with his massive outgoing expenses for the new downtown complex. By the time his accountants realized there was a discrepancy in the reports, the money was completely gone, secured in an offshore account his lawyers will never touch. I stripped him of his working capital right before he needed it most." I sat rigidly on David's sofa, listening to her explicit confession of wire fraud and grand larceny. The audio was pristine. Every syllable was perfectly preserved. David clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he heard his wife brag about attempting to bankrupt his life work. Harrison shook his head in mock amazement. $1.5 million, he said, letting a low whistle escape his lips. "Madison, I have to admit, I am completely blown away. That takes incredible nerve." But there is still one thing I do not understand. His bank would never process staggered outgoing wire transfers of that magnitude without authorized physical signatures from the primary account holder. You could not just request those transfers online. They require verified documentation. How did you bypass the signature verification protocol without his legal team flagging it? That is where family loyalty comes in, Madison, said her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. I knew I could not forge his signature myself. David knows my handwriting, and the bank tellers might have recognized the discrepancy. So I went to my father. Richard spent years reviewing David architectural contracts. He knows his signature perfectly. My father sat down at his desk, took a specialized drafting pen, and flawlessly forged David's signature on every single one of the authorizations. He practiced for hours until it was an exact match. The bank processed the paperwork immediately. She had just implicated our father in federal forgery. Harrison leaned forward, keeping his voice steady and encouraging. Richard forged the documents. That is incredibly risky. But banks still require notarized verification for transfers exceeding a certain threshold. A forged signature is one thing, but a missing notary seal halts the process. Madison burst into genuine laughter, finding the situation absolutely hilarious. Oh, Harrison, do you really think we would overlook something that basic? My mother is a licensed notary public. Patricia took the forged authorization forms, stamped them with her official state seal, and deliberately backdated the entries in her ledger to make it look like David signed them months prior in her presence. It was a complete family operation. They knew David was trying to leave me with nothing, so they did what they had to do to protect my future. We outsmarted his entire legal division. I have $1.5 million waiting for me, and David is walking away completely ruined. The silence following her confession was heavy and absolute. In the lounge, Harrison simply stared at her, his expression a masterpiece of calculated awe. Back in the townhouse, David and I shared a look of pure victory. We had the entire criminal conspiracy detailed on tape directly from the primary orchestrator. We had the motive, the method, and the explicit admission of complicity from both parents. Harrison broke the silence, raising his glass one last time. Madison, he said softly, you are truly something else. I promise you this divorce mediation is going to be an experience you will never forget. Madison beamed, convinced she had secured the ultimate prize. She clinked her glass against his, completely oblivious that she had just permanently sealed her own fate and handed us the exact weapon we needed to destroy her. Harrison did not linger at the boutique hotel lounge after securing the confession. He expertly wrapped up the evening, citing an early morning conference call with international investors. He paid the exorbitant tab, kissed Madison politely on the cheek, and left her sitting in the velvet booth, completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. Madison, desperate to solidify her triumph, clearly went straight home and spun a wild, exaggerated narrative for our parents. She needed them to believe she had entirely conquered the billionaire, sealing the deal in every possible way to ensure I would be permanently pushed out of the picture. Harrison arrived back at David Townhouse just before midnight. He unbuttoned his collar, pulled the discreet recording device from his ribs, and placed it securely on the kitchen island. We spent the next 2 hours backing up the audio files to 3 separate encrypted servers. The evidence was irrefutable, pristine, and incredibly damning. We finally went to sleep knowing the hardest part of the operation was over. The physical trap was set, but I knew my family well enough to know the emotional closure was still coming. Patricia would not be able to resist twisting the knife. She would need to ensure I understood exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy before I supposedly returned from Chicago. The next morning, Sunday, the townhouse was quiet and filled with tense anticipation. Tomorrow was the mandatory divorce mediation. David was standing at the kitchen counter, dressed in a casual sweater, methodically organizing the red legal binders that contained the forged tax documents and the offshore bank routing numbers. Harrison was sitting at the breakfast bar, drinking black coffee and reviewing his aggressive litigation strategy on his tablet. I was sitting at the heavy wooden dining table, my laptop open, running a final audit on the financial timelines to ensure absolutely nothing could be legally contested. It was peaceful, functional, and devoid of the toxic anxiety that usually accompanied any gathering with my actual blood relatives. At exactly 10 in the morning, my cell phone lit up on the table. The screen displayed a bright, smiling photo of my mother, Patricia. I stared at the caller identification for a long moment. This was the final act of their betrayal. I did not feel any dread or sadness. I felt a cold, sharp focus. I reached across the table, tapped the screen to answer the call, and immediately pressed the speakerphone button. I simultaneously hit the record key on my laptop audio software. David stopped sorting his documents. Harrison lowered his tablet. Both men looked at the phone, their expressions tightening with protective anger. I held up a single finger, signaling them to remain absolutely silent. "Hello, Mom," I said, keeping my voice soft and slightly muffled, perfectly mimicking the tone of someone sitting in a dreary hotel room in Chicago. Patricia did not bother with pleasantries. She bypassed basic human decency entirely and launched straight into the execution. Claire listened to me very carefully. Patricia began, her voice brittle and entirely devoid of maternal warmth. "I am calling to inform you of a significant change in the family dynamic. Madison called me late last night after you left for your trip. She and Harrison spent the evening together. They are deeply in love, Claire. They slept together, and they have formed a profound, undeniable connection that you simply could not provide for him." I caught Harrison rolling his eyes in absolute disgust at the blatant lie, but he remained completely silent. Madison had fabricated a physical relationship to stake her territorial claim, and Patricia was eagerly weaponizing that lie to destroy me. "I see," I replied softly, offering her absolutely zero emotional reaction to feed on. "Do not use that flat, boring tone with me," Patricia snapped, irritated by my lack of hysterics. "You need to be realistic about this situation. Harrison is a man of immense wealth and influence. He requires a partner who understands his world, someone who is vibrant and socially adept. You are a forensic accountant. You are socially unfit for a man of his stature anyway. Madison is simply taking her rightful place beside him. He is going to give her the luxurious, protected life that David completely failed to provide. This is what is best for the family, and you are going to accept it with grace." The sheer cruelty of her words hung in the quiet kitchen. She was actively discarding her eldest daughter, effectively firing me from my own relationship to clear the path for her favorite child. "So what exactly are you telling me to do, Mom?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "I am telling you not to cause a scene when you get back from Chicago," Patricia commanded coldly. "In fact, do not come back to our house at all right now. Madison needs a peaceful environment to nurture this new relationship, and your negative energy will only ruin it. We are focusing all our attention on supporting her through her mediation tomorrow. We simply do not have the emotional bandwidth to deal with your jealousy or your tears. Stay in your apartment, focus on your little numbers, and let your sister be happy for once in her life. Goodbye, Claire." The line clicked dead. She did not wait for my response. She had delivered her fatal blow and severed the cord completely. I sat looking at the darkened screen of my phone. The kitchen was completely silent. David looked absolutely sickened by the profound lack of parental empathy he had just witnessed. Harrison looked furious, his jaw clenched tightly. They were waiting for me to break down. But no tears came. My eyes were completely dry. I felt lighter than I had in 33 years. I permanently saved the audio recording of Patricia completely disowning me. I looked up at David and Harrison, a genuine, terrifying smile spreading across my face. The trap was primed perfectly today. Monday morning arrived with the sterile chill of an impending legal execution. The scene shifted entirely to a high-end mediation conference room located on the 42nd floor of a glass skyscraper in downtown Manhattan. The room was designed to intimidate. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the concrete canyons of the financial district, heavily polished mahogany tables, and ergonomic leather chairs that cost more than most people made in a month. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, keeping the temperature deliberately cold to prevent anyone from getting too comfortable during negotiations. David sat completely alone on one side of the massive wooden table. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit, his posture relaxed but entirely unreadable. He had intentionally instructed his own legal team, including Harrison, to remain in the adjacent waiting area until he gave the signal. He wanted Madison to feel an overwhelming sense of superiority right out of the gate. He wanted her to walk into that room and see a defeated, isolated man who had already surrendered to the inevitable. At precisely 10 in the morning, the heavy glass doors swung open. Madison entered the conference room looking like she had just stepped off the cover of a luxury lifestyle magazine. She was wearing a pristine white designer suit that projected aggressive innocence, carrying a leather tote bag that easily cost $10,000. She was flanked immediately by our parents, Richard and Patricia, who walked into the room with their heads held high, practically radiating unearned arrogance. They took their seats across from David with synchronized smugness. Richard adjusted his expensive silk tie, looking around the opulent room as if he already owned the building. Patricia placed her designer purse carefully on the table, offering David a thin, condescending smile that did absolutely nothing to hide her utter contempt. Finally, Madison aggressive lead attorney, a shark named Marcus Thorne, strode into the room carrying two thick leather briefcases. Thorne was notorious in the city for securing exorbitant divorce settlements through relentless bullying and financial intimidation. He did not even bother to shake David's hand. He simply dropped his briefcases onto the table with a loud, aggressive thud and took the seat directly next to Madison. Thorne opened his primary binder, pulled out a thick stack of aggressively drafted legal documents, and spread them across the mahogany surface. He did not waste any time with pleasantries or mediation protocols. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and fixed David with a predatory glare. "We are not here to negotiate today," Thorne began, his voice booming with absolute authority. "My client has suffered extreme emotional distress and significant lifestyle degradation due to your persistent neglect and financial opacity. We have reviewed your publicly available commercial assets, and we have drafted a comprehensive settlement agreement. If you wish to avoid a highly publicized, deeply humiliating trial that will undoubtedly destroy your real estate firm reputation, you will sign these terms exactly as they are written. There is no room for counteroffers." David remained perfectly still, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. He simply nodded once, encouraging the lawyer to continue his performance. Thorne interpreted the silence as submission and plunged right into the delusional demands. First, Thorne stated, tapping a manicured finger against the top document. "My client requires immediate and sole ownership of the Brooklyn townhouse, complete with all current furnishings and artwork. You will vacate the premises within 48 hours. Second, regarding the children, my client is demanding full legal and physical custody. You will be granted restricted visitation rights every other weekend contingent upon your ability to provide a suitable living environment, which we will strictly monitor. We are demanding maximum child support payments based on the projected future earnings of your development firm, not just your current liquid assets. We both know you have been hiding capital in offshore shell companies to avoid paying your fair share, and the court will severely punish you for that if we go to trial." The sheer audacity of the accusation almost made David laugh, considering who had actually set up the offshore shell company. He maintained his neutral expression, looking directly at Madison. She was practically glowing with victory, convinced that her secret Cayman Islands account was perfectly hidden and that she was successfully projecting her own financial crimes onto him. She looked at David with a mixture of pity and absolute triumph, fully believing she had outsmarted a titan of industry. Thorne was not finished. He flipped to the final page of his binder, his voice rising in volume. "Finally, we come to the matter of spousal support. My client has grown accustomed to a highly specific, luxurious standard of living during this marriage. You actively encouraged her to step away from any potential career to manage your domestic life. Therefore, we are demanding permanent alimony in the amount of $50,000 per month to be paid on the first of every month without exception. If you fail to meet any of these financial obligations, we will immediately file motions to seize your commercial properties and freeze your business operating accounts. The demands were entirely unhinged. $50,000 a month full custody, despite Madison practically ignoring her children for years, and the loss of his primary residence. It was a complete financial execution. David looked past the lawyer and focused entirely on Patricia. My mother had been watching the exchange with rapt attention, drinking in every single word of the aggressive demands. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, unable to contain her venom any longer. "You really should just sign the papers, David." Patricia sneered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, masking a deep, ugly prejudice. "You have done quite well for yourself considering where you started. But we all knew this day would eventually come. You managed to hustle your way into our world, but your kind of luck always runs out eventually. You simply lack the pedigree to sustain this level of wealth. Madison deserves to be with someone who naturally belongs in high society, someone who does not have to constantly pretend. Just be a gentleman. Surrender the assets and walk away before we are forced to completely strip you of whatever little dignity you have left." David did not react to the racially charged insult. He did not raise his voice or show any sign of anger. He simply took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy silence stretch across the cold conference room. He looked at Thorne, then at Madison, and finally at Richard and Patricia. He reached into his inside jacket pocket, pulled out his cell phone, and placed it gently on the table. He tapped the screen once. That was the signal. "Actually," David said, his voice terrifyingly calm and steady, "I do not think I will be signing any of those documents today. In fact, I think the scope of this mediation is about to change entirely." The heavy glass doors of the conference room clicked open behind them. Harrison stepped across the threshold, and the entire atmospheric pressure of the high-end conference room instantly shifted. He was no longer playing the role of the relaxed, casual investor who had charmed my sister in the dimly lit boutique hotel lounge just 24 hours prior. Gone was the open collar, the relaxed posture, and the easy billion-dollar smile that had completely disarmed her. Today, he was dressed strictly for war. He wore a razor-sharp, bespoke charcoal legal suit that screamed corporate executioner. His crisp white shirt and muted silver tie projected absolute authority. His posture was rigid, his expression entirely devoid of warmth, familiarity, or any trace of the romantic interest he had so perfectly faked. His heavy leather dress shoes clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor, each step sounding like the ticking of a very dangerous, unavoidable clock, marking the end of their grift. The faint hum of the building air conditioning seemed to quiet down, submitting to the sheer force of his presence in the room. Madison did not notice the drastic, chilling change in his demeanor right away. Her profound narcissism acted as a thick blinder, completely filtering out any visual information that contradicted her own tightly woven personal narrative. When she turned her head and saw him standing in the open doorway, her entire face lit up with absolute, unadulterated delight. The aggressive, highly victimized persona she had been projecting for her ruthless lawyer vanished in a split second, replaced instantly by the eager, fawning expression of a woman who genuinely believed she had just won the ultimate societal prize. She practically leaped up from her expensive ergonomic chair, hastily smoothing the front of her pristine white designer suit to ensure she looked perfect for her supposed savior. She truly believed he had abandoned his busy schedule and rushed downtown solely to witness her magnificent victory over the husband she was attempting to bankrupt. She thought this was the grand, cinematic gesture of a wildly successful man staking his romantic claim. "Babe, you came to support me," Madison exclaimed, her voice echoing loudly and inappropriately in the sterile, tension-filled conference room. She took a confident step toward him, extending both her hands, completely ready to embrace him in front of David, her parents, and her highly paid, bewildered attorney. She wanted to proudly flaunt him. She desperately wanted David to see the vastly superior man she had successfully secured to replace him. Patricia practically beamed from her seat, her chest puffing out with overwhelming maternal pride at the sight of her daughter wealthy new conquest arriving precisely on time to deliver the final humiliating blow to her soon-to-be ex-son-in-law. Richard crossed his arms, smirking, fully expecting Harrison to demand David surrender immediately and hand over the assets. They were entirely wrapped up in their shared family delusion, completely blind to the lethal reality walking straight toward them. Harrison did not even look at her. He completely ignored her outstretched hands, her eager smile, and her sickeningly sweet greeting. He did not offer a single nod of acknowledgement to Patricia or Richard as he passed their side of the table. He walked right past them, with the icy, terrifying detachment of a man walking past a row of completely empty chairs. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, his jaw firmly set, moving with singular, devastating purpose toward the opposite side of the massive mahogany table. The sudden freezing rejection hung heavy in the air, instantly shattering the triumphant romantic illusion Madison had so carefully constructed in her own mind. Her hands dropped slowly to her sides, a flicker of genuine panicked confusion crossing her perfectly manicured features. She looked back at her mother seeking reassurance, but Patricia's smile had also frozen, replaced by a sudden creeping sense of dread as she watched the billionaire ignore her daughter entirely. Harrison reached David's side of the table and stopped. He unbuttoned his charcoal suit jacket with practiced fluid efficiency and took the empty leather chair directly to David Wright. He lifted his sleek black leather briefcase and tossed it casually but forcefully onto the polished wood. It hit the solid surface with a heavy, authoritative thud that violently rattled the expensive silver pens sitting right next to Marcus Thorne, aggressively drafted settlement documents. Harrison snapped the dual silver locks open in perfect unison, the sharp metallic clicks cutting like a knife through the sudden suffocating silence that had abruptly descended upon the room. He did not rush. He moved with the terrifying, deliberate patience of a man who held all the winning cards and was fully prepared to let the opposing side bleed out slowly. Marcus Thorne stared at the newcomer, his highly aggressive bullying posture faltering for the very first time since he had swaggered into the room. He looked quickly from David, who remained perfectly calm and comfortably seated, to Harrison, who was now methodically extracting a single incredibly thick red file folder from his briefcase. Thorne was a notorious legal bully, but he was also a seasoned courtroom predator, and he immediately recognized the distinct scent of a much bigger, far more dangerous apex predator entering his defined territory. He realized instantly that David's confident silence was not submission at all, it was an ambush. "Who the hell are you?" Thorne demanded, his booming voice losing a significant fraction of its previous bluster as his brain scrambled frantically to understand the sudden massive power shift in the room dynamic. He frantically reviewed his case files, trying to identify this unexpected threat. Harrison completely ignored the aggressive opposing lawyer for another long, agonizing moment. He placed the heavy red file folder deliberately in the absolute center of his space on the table, resting his hands flat against the mahogany surface. Only then did he finally lift his head and make direct eye contact with the opposing side. He bypassed Thorne entirely and locked his dark, unwavering gaze directly onto Madison. The absolute lack of affection in his eyes was terrifying to witness. He looked at her, not as a lover, not as an easy mark, but as if she were a complicated legal puzzle he was about to systematically dismantle and destroy. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. "Harrison Cole." He stated, his voice ringing out across the cold room with crystal-clear, unwavering authority that commanded absolute attention from everyone present. "I am the lead counsel for the respondent." David Harrison continued formally introducing himself while keeping his eyes deadlocked on my sister. He let that official title hang in the frigid air conditioning, allowing the sheer crushing weight of his true identity to crash down upon them. He was not a savior. He was the executioner. He watched the realization slowly infect their arrogant expressions. "And I must thank you, Madison," he added, his tone suddenly dripping with lethal, devastating sincerity. "I genuinely appreciate the incredibly insightful meeting we had at the hotel lounge last night. Your candid admissions saved my team an enormous amount of time. Madison went completely pale, all the triumphant color draining from her face instantly. She collapsed backward into her ergonomic chair as the catastrophic reality violently snapped shut around her, sealing her fate completely. Marcus Thorne was the first to physically react. He slammed his hands against the heavy mahogany table, shoving his chair back with a loud, aggressive scrape. You cannot simply walk in here and declare yourself lead counsel without prior filing, Thorne bellowed, attempting to project an authority he no longer possessed. This is a highly irregular ambush. I demand a recess. I demand to know exactly what kind of unethical stunt the respondent is attempting to pull today. We will not be subjected to theatrical intimidation tactics. Harrison did not even blink. He reached into the deep pocket of his charcoal suit jacket and calmly extracted a small, heavy black cylinder. It was a high-fidelity Bluetooth speaker. He placed it carefully on the table right next to the thick red file folder and tapped the top power button. A soft blue light illuminated the dark metal rim. He pulled his cell phone from his inner pocket, his fingers dancing briefly across the glass screen. There is absolutely no need for a recess, Marcus Harrison said, his voice entirely conversational but laced with lethal intent. We are perfectly prepared to proceed with the mediation. In fact, we are fully prepared to expedite it. I understand your client has presented a highly specific narrative regarding my client's financial integrity. Rather than engage in a tedious time-consuming debate over her fabricated allegations, I thought it would be significantly more efficient to let your client speak for herself. Before Thorne could formulate a coherent legal objection, before Madison could find the breath to scream, Harrison pressed play. The pristine, crystal-clear audio filled the freezing conference room instantly. It was undeniable. It was the exact conversation from the dimly lit boutique hotel lounge preserved with terrifying clarity. Madison's own voice echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows, dripping with the arrogant, predatory smugness she had displayed just 14 hours earlier. The recording started precisely at the most damaging moment. You think I do not have tactical expertise, Madison recorded. Voice challenged through the speaker, the audio perfectly capturing the clinking of champagne flutes in the background. You think I am just some pretty face who got lucky. Let me tell you how wrong you are, Harrison. I did not just hide a few $1,000s. I orchestrated a complete offshore diversion of his liquid assets. I went online and set up an untraceable shell company in the Cayman Islands. Madison clamped her hands over her ears, her eyes squeezed tightly shut, shaking her head violently from side to side. "Stop it!" she shrieked, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated panic. "Stop playing that. Turn it off right now." Harrison ignored her completely. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers, watching the audio absolutely decimate the opposing side. Repetition is a powerful thing, and hearing her own arrogant words repeated in this sterile legal environment was absolute psychological torture. The recording continued without mercy. I funneled $1.5 million straight out of his primary operating accounts over 6 months. Madison's voice bragged loudly. I did it in staggered increments, so it would blend with his massive outgoing expenses for the new downtown complex. By the time his accountants realized there was a discrepancy in the reports, the money was completely gone. Richard and Patricia were paralyzed. They sat rigidly in their ergonomic chairs, their earlier arrogance entirely vaporized. Patricia's knuckles were stark white as she gripped the edges of the mahogany table, her breathing shallow and rapid. Richard's face had turned a sickly ashen gray. They knew exactly what was coming next. Thorne was frantically shuffling his papers, his face flushed red with professional fury and sudden terrifying exposure. "You cannot play unverified recordings in a formal mediation setting," he shouted over the audio. "This is completely inadmissible." Harrison simply smiled, a cold, calculating expression that offered zero comfort. "Let the tape finish, Marcus," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a subtle, undeniable threat. "You need to hear this. That is where family loyalty comes in." Madison's voice continued through the Bluetooth speaker, plunging the final dagger into her parents. "I knew I could not forge his signature myself, so I went to my father. Richard spent years reviewing David architectural contracts, He knows his signature perfectly. My father sat down at his desk, took a specialized drafting pen, and flawlessly forged David's signature on every single one of the authorizations. He practiced for hours until it was an exact match. Richard let out a strangled, pathetic sound, clutching his chest. Patricia squeezed her eyes shut, silent tears of sheer terror spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks. My mother is a licensed notary public. The recorded Madison laughed cruelly. Patricia took the forged authorization forms, stamped them with her official state seal, and deliberately backdated the entries in her ledger. Harrison reached forward and calmly tapped the screen of his phone, pausing the playback. The sudden silence in the conference room was deafening. The blue light on the speaker pulsed rhythmically, a silent witness to their total destruction. Madison leaped up from her chair, her face contorted in a mask of absolute feral desperation. "You cannot use that!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at Harrison. "That is highly illegal. You recorded me without my permission. I did not consent to being recorded in that hotel. I know my rights. You violated my privacy, and a judge will throw that tape out immediately. You are breaking the law." Harrison let out a slow, dark chuckle. He picked up the heavy red file folder, opened it, and extracted a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the smooth wooden table toward the aggressive, thoroughly defeated lawyer. "You clearly do not know your rights," Madison Harrison said, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto hers with merciless precision. "You see, we are operating in New York. Under New York Penal Law Section 250.00, this state operates under a strict one-party consent rule for audio recordings. That means it is entirely legal to record a private conversation as long as one active participant in that conversation provides explicit consent. And since I was an active participant in our chat, and since I eagerly consented to wearing a high-grade federal wire to capture your confession, the recording is undeniably legal. It is fully admissible in both civil and criminal court." Thorne stared blankly at the paper, his professional career flashing before his eyes. He realized he was not just representing a greedy spouse, he was actively representing a criminal syndicate. "We are not just talking about divorce anymore, Madison." Harrison continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You did not just secure a settlement, you committed federal wire fraud. You committed grand larceny. You committed corporate espionage. And you implicated both of your parents in felony forgery, fraudulent notarization, and active criminal conspiracy." Richard slumped forward onto the mahogany table, burying his face in his trembling hands, letting out a low sob. Patricia stared blankly at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her mind fracturing as the reality of federal prison set in. Harrison leaned back, gesturing toward the extremely thick settlement binders Thorne had aggressively slammed onto the table earlier. "Now," Harrison said calmly, "let us discuss those $50,000 monthly alimony payments." The heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open for a second time, slicing abruptly through the suffocating tension that had just paralyzed Marcus Thorne and his terrified clients. The sudden noise made everyone flinch. I stepped confidently over the threshold, leaving the submissive sister persona permanently outside. I was wearing a sharply tailored dark navy power suit, a crisp silk blouse, and black stilettos that clicked with rhythmic authority against the hardwood floor. My posture was rigid, my expression devoid of emotion. In my arms, I carried 3 massive, heavily indexed red binders, packed with thousands of pages of financial ruin. Richard was the first to react, his shattered nerves manifesting as irrational rage. He leaped out of his ergonomic chair, his face flushed an ugly purple. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at me. "Claire, what the hell are you doing here?" he bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. "Get out of this room right now. This is a highly confidential legal proceeding. You have absolutely no business being here. Have you lost your mind? Get out before I have building security forcibly remove you." I completely ignored his pathetic outburst. I did not break my stride or offer him a single glance of recognition. I walked straight to the center of the massive mahogany table, stopping right next to Harrison. I raised the 3 heavy red binders and dropped them onto the polished wood. The impact sounded like a gunshot in the freezing room. Thorne physically jumped in his seat. "I am not here as your daughter, Richard," I said, projecting my voice with cold precision. "And I am certainly not here as your sister Madison. I am a court-appointed forensic accountant. I was officially retained by David legal team exactly 3 months ago." The collective gasp from my family was audible. Madison's jaw dropped, her perfectly painted lips parting in sheer shock. Her mind completely short-circuited trying to process the catastrophic reality. The boring, pathetic spinster she had mocked her entire life was the architect of her destruction. 3 months ago, David noticed a highly sophisticated bleed on his primary operating capital. I continued maintaining unwavering eye contact with Marcus Thorne, who was now sweating profusely. He knew someone was aggressively siphoning funds, but the internal routing was masked by staggered vendor payments. He needed someone who could dismantle the architecture of the fraud without alerting the perpetrator. He hired me. I opened the first massive red binder, flipping past the protective cover sheet. "You see, Madison? You thought you were incredibly clever setting up a shell company in the Cayman Islands. You used a variation of a vendor name David frequently uses for overseas steel imports. It was a decent amateur move. But you made one fundamental mistake. You assumed you were the smartest person in the room." I pulled a thick stack of authentic wire transfer receipts from the rings and slid them across the table. They came to a stop inches from Madison, trembling hands. "This binder contains the authentic digital receipts from the past 6 months," I stated. "Every single staggered payment you made amounting to exactly $1.5 million. I tracked every digital footprint. You used your personal laptop, connected to the exact same wireless internet router in your marital home, to register the offshore entity. I have the IP logs. That is not tactical expertise. That is sheer stupidity." Thorne swallowed hard, pushing his own aggressive settlement documents to the side. He was staring at my evidence with the horrified fascination of a man watching a train derail. "But the digital wire transfers were only half the puzzle," I said, opening the second red binder. "I needed the physical authorization forms, the ones you claimed were legally signed by David. And that is exactly where my own family graciously provided the undeniable proof of their own criminal conspiracy." I shifted my gaze to my parents. Patricia looked like she was about to vomit. Richard was hyperventilating. "2 weeks ago, you invited me to Sunday dinner. You buttered me up and handed me a stack of tax documents. You demanded that I use my professional credentials to fix a few minor discrepancies to help Madison out with her divorce. You thought you could manipulate the obedient sister into burying your financial anomalies. You genuinely believed I was too blind to read between the lines." I extracted the forged tax documents from the second binder. I slid them across the mahogany wood, placing them deliberately on top of the wire receipts. "Those are the exact documents you handed me, Mom. They contain the forged signatures Richard practiced for hours to perfect. They also contain the fraudulent notary stamps you applied, complete with your backdated ledger entries. You handed a certified forensic investigator the physical, irrefutable proof of your federal crimes completely voluntarily." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. I did not just look at the signatures. I ran a chemical analysis on the ink. The specific ink Richard used to sign these supposedly year-old documents was manufactured less than 4 months ago. The notary seal Patricia used was applied with a heavy, uneven pressure that indicates rushed stamping. The corresponding ledger entries were written in sequential order with the exact same pen, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt they were not logged on the dates you claimed. Madison let out a pathetic whimper. The invincible armor of her arrogance was entirely shattered. She realized she was completely surrounded by traps she had willingly walked into. "You completely discarded me yesterday morning," I said, locking eyes with my mother. "You called me while I was supposedly freezing in Chicago. You told me I was socially unfit. You told me not to come back to your house because my negative energy would ruin Madison's new luxurious life. But I was not in Chicago. I was sitting in David's kitchen, sitting right next to Harrison, finalizing the criminal timeline that is going to put every single one of you in federal prison." I turned my attention back to the opposing lawyer. "Marcus, your client is currently holding stolen funds. If you do not immediately advise her to surrender the entire $1.5 million back to David operating accounts within 24 hours, you will be named as an accessory after the fact in a massive federal racketeering investigation. David is not giving up his Brooklyn townhouse. He is taking full, uncontested legal and physical custody of his children, and he will not be paying a single dime of alimony. In fact, Madison will be paying full legal restitution for the rest of her miserable life. Marcus Thorne did not say a single word at first. He simply reached out with a slightly trembling hand and pulled the top red binder closer to his side of the mahogany table. The aggressive swagger he had carried into the room just 20 minutes prior had completely evaporated, replaced by the sheer cold terror of a legal professional realizing he was standing on a live landmine. He flipped the heavy cover open. He stared at the high-resolution photographs of the forged tax documents. He traced his index finger over the chemical analysis report detailing the ink age. He turned the page and scrutinized the offshore routing numbers, matching them perfectly against the staggered withdrawal amounts from David operating accounts. He read the IP logs, linking the Cayman Islands shell company directly to Madison marital home. He stared at the fraudulent notary stamp, specifically noting the heavy, uneven pressure I had pointed out. Thorne was a brutal negotiator, but he was not a criminal. He operated strictly within the boundaries of aggressive civil litigation. He had built a highly lucrative career by bullying weaker opponents into submission, but he never crossed the line into federal racketeering. As he stared at the undeniable proof of wire fraud, grand larceny, and felony forgery, his face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. He slowly lifted his head and looked at Madison. The expression of predatory confidence she had worn all morning was gone, replaced by a pathetic, wide-eyed panic. She looked back at him, her lips trembling silently, pleading with him to deploy some magical legal loophole to save her from the consequences of her own actions. "Marcus, do something!" Madison whispered frantically, her voice barely carrying across the table. "Object to the evidence. Tell them it is inadmissible. Tell them they cannot use my private hotel conversation. You are a shark. Attack them. Fix this right now." Thorne did not attack. He did not object. Instead, he reached out and forcefully closed the thick red binder. He slid it away from him as if the physical object itself was radioactive. He stood up from his expensive ergonomic chair with deliberate, terrifying finality. He reached for his first leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks open, and began violently shoving his aggressively drafted settlement demands and red pens inside. He grabbed his legal pads, completely ignoring the carefully organized structure he had set up to intimidate David. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking with sheer desperation as he watched their only line of defense pack his bags. "You cannot just pack up. You represent my daughter. We are paying you a massive retainer to handle this mediation. You need to file an injunction immediately. You need to protect us from these completely baseless accusations." Thorne completely ignored my father. He snapped the first briefcase shut and reached for the second. He was moving with the frantic, highly focused energy of a man escaping a burning building. He did not care about his massive retainer. He did not care about his lucrative client. He only cared about saving his own professional license and avoiding a federal indictment for conspiracy. He slammed the second briefcase shut, locked it, and gripped both handles tightly. He looked directly at Harrison, ignoring Madison and my parents entirely. He needed to make an official statement to distance himself permanently from the radioactive blast radius. "Let the record show," Thorne announced, his voice projecting loudly across the freezing conference room, "that I, Marcus Thorne, acting as legal counsel for the petitioner, was entirely unaware of the actions detailed in these documents and the audio recording provided today. I was materially and deliberately misled by my client regarding the fundamental facts of this case. I was explicitly told that the financial discrepancies were the result of the respondent hiding assets, not an active, highly illegal siphoning operation orchestrated by my own client. I refuse to be made a party to federal wire fraud, grand larceny, or criminal conspiracy. The ethical boundaries of my profession and the strict laws of the State Bar Association strictly prohibit me from representing an individual who has actively engaged in felony fraud to secure a marital settlement. Therefore, effective immediately, I am officially withdrawing as counsel for Madison. Madison leaped out of her chair, lunging forward and grabbing the sleeve of his expensive suit. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You cannot leave me here! You are my lawyer! You promised me you would destroy him!" Thorne violently yanked his arm out of her grasp, his eyes blazing with absolute disgust. He looked at her as if she were a diseased rat. "I am no longer your lawyer, Madison," he spat coldly, his voice dripping with venom. "I strongly advise you to secure criminal defense counsel immediately because you are going to desperately need it. Do not ever contact my firm again. If you call my office, my secretary will hang up on you." He turned on his heel and marched rapidly toward the heavy glass doors. He did not look back. He did not offer a single word of comfort to the family he was abandoning to the wolves. He hit the metal push bar, shoved the door open, and disappeared down the long carpeted hallway. The heavy glass door swung shut on its pneumatic hinge, clicking securely into the metal frame, permanently sealing my family inside the room. They were completely alone. The aggressive, high-priced legal shield they had purchased to destroy David was gone, shattered into a million pieces by the sheer weight of their own extreme arrogance. Madison sank slowly back into her leather chair, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Richard and Patricia sat perfectly frozen in their seats, staring blankly at the closed door, completely and utterly defenseless against the absolute slaughter that was about to commence. The heavy glass door clicked shut, sealing the tomb. The silence inside the conference room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, shallow breathing of my father and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Madison sat frozen, staring at the empty space where her ruthless, expensive lawyer had been sitting just seconds ago. Harrison did not give them a moment to process the abandonment. He did not offer them a single second to breathe or formulate a backup plan. He leaned forward, rested his elbows on the polished mahogany table, and steepled his fingers, staring directly at the three terrified individuals sitting across from him. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had violently flipped, and Harrison was fully prepared to crush them under the immense weight of their own arrogance. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin manila folder, dropping it onto the table next to my massive red binders. "Let us dispense with the theatrical negotiations," Harrison said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Since you no longer have legal representation, I am going to make this incredibly simple for you. We are going to discuss the actual terms of your surrender." Harrison opened the thin folder and extracted a newly drafted, legally binding settlement agreement. It was significantly shorter than the aggressive demands Thorne had previously presented. "There will be absolutely no negotiations today." Harrison began sliding the document to the center of the table. "You are going to sign this exact document right now. First, we will address the financial division. David will retain 100% ownership and control of his real estate development firm, his commercial properties, and all associated liquid assets. He will also retain sole ownership of the primary residence in Brooklyn. You will have until exactly 5 o'clock tomorrow evening to remove your personal clothing and basic necessities from the townhouse. You will leave behind all artwork, high-value jewelry, purchased with marital funds, and the imported furniture. You are walking away with nothing but the clothes on your back." Furthermore, Harrison continued, his gaze locking onto Madison, "there will be zero spousal support. You will not receive $50,000 a month. You will not receive $50 a month. You are completely severed from David financial ecosystem. In addition, you have exactly 24 hours to authorize the full unmitigated return of the $1.5 million you illegally funneled into your Cayman Islands shell company. If that money is not sitting securely in David primary operating account by noon tomorrow, we trigger the contingency plan." Madison let out a choked gasp, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically struck. "You cannot do that," she whispered, her voice trembling violently. "I have nothing. I gave up my career. You cannot leave me on the street." Harrison completely ignored her pathetic plea. He turned the page of the settlement agreement. "Now we will discuss the children. Under no circumstances will you be granted full legal or physical custody. David is assuming 100% sole legal custody of both children effective immediately. You are an admitted felon who actively attempted to bankrupt their father and destroy their financial future. You are fundamentally unfit to parent. You will be granted restricted, strictly supervised visitation rights for exactly 4 hours every other Saturday, conducted at a court-approved neutral facility with a professional monitor present at all times. You will not be allowed to take the children overnight. You will not be allowed to travel with them. And you will absolutely not be allowed to bring any unapproved individuals around them, including your parents who are now legally recognized accomplices in a federal fraud investigation." Richard slammed his fist weakly against the table. "You are destroying our family," he hissed, tears of absolute panic welling in his eyes. "You are taking everything from her. You cannot enforce this. A judge will never allow an absolute unilateral stripping of assets and custody without a trial." Harrison smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made Richard shrink backward in his chair. "You are entirely correct," Richard, Harrison agreed smoothly. "A family court judge would definitely want a trial. But we are not going to family court if you fight this. If Madison does not pick up a pen and sign the last page of this document within the next 60 seconds, I am packing up my briefcase. I will walk out of this high-end skyscraper, get into my car, and drive directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office downtown. I will hand them these 3 massive red binders compiled by a court-appointed forensic accountant. I will hand them the high-fidelity audio recordings of your daughter explicitly detailing her offshore wire fraud. And I will hand them the precise chemical analysis proving you committed felony forgery and your wife committed fraudulent notarization. You will all be indicted for federal racketeering and conspiracy," Harrison promised, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Madison will face up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. You and Patricia will face significant prison time for forgery and accessory crimes. The children will be shielded from your toxic influence forever while you sit in a concrete cell. So you have a choice. You can sign the paper and walk away completely broke, or you can refuse to sign, and I will personally ensure you lose your freedom. The choice is yours." The reality of the absolute devastation finally shattered the last remaining pieces of Madison's arrogant delusion. She broke. She leaned forward, burying her face in her hands, and began to sob. It was not a delicate, manipulative cry. It was a hysterical, ugly, gasping breakdown. She wailed loudly, her shoulders heaving, her pristine white designer suit suddenly looking like a pathetic costume on a completely broken woman. Patricia wrapped her arms around herself, sobbing quietly while Richard stared blankly at the wall, completely destroyed. The pathetic sound of my family completely falling apart echoed loudly in the sterile conference room. Madison continued to heave with ugly, gasping sobs, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-stained face. Patricia rocked back and forth in her expensive leather chair, whimpering softly, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso, as if trying to hold her shattering reality together. Richard remained frozen for a long minute, staring blankly at the blank wall, until his eyes slowly drifted across the mahogany table and locked onto me. The sheer, overwhelming panic in his chest suddenly mutated into desperate, irrational anger. He could not accept that he had been outsmarted by the daughter he had spent 33 years aggressively underestimating. He pushed himself up from the table, his hands trembling violently as he leaned forward. "Claire, how could you do this to us?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking with a sickening mixture of rage and pleading. "We are your family. We are your blood. You set us up. You walked into our home, ate at our dinner table, and actively plotted to destroy your own sister. You allied yourself with this man instead of your own flesh and blood. You purposefully laid a trap for your own mother and father. What kind of sick, twisted person does that? I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the man who had ignored my every achievement and calmly rested my hands on the thick red binders containing his federal felonies. Do not ever use the word family with me again, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying absolute calm that cut straight through Madison, hysterical sobbing. Family is a concept built on mutual respect, protection, and loyalty. What you and Patricia built was a transactional hierarchy. Madison was your prized investment, the golden child destined to marry into wealth and elevate your social status. I was simply the administrative backup plan. I was the boring, reliable workhorse you kept in the stable, just in case you ever needed the bills paid or your messes cleaned up. You never loved me, Richard. You simply tolerated my existence because my stability subsidized your chaotic, pathetic obsession with high society. You did not invite me to Sunday dinner because you missed your eldest daughter. You invited me because Madison needed a federal crime covered up. And you genuinely believed I was stupid enough to risk my own forensic license and my own freedom to facilitate her massive greed. You want to talk about setting people up? I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step around the mahogany table toward them. Let us talk about who actually set the trap. I did not force Madison to open a fraudulent offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. I did not force her to steal $1.5 million from the man who gave her absolutely everything. I did not force you to sit at your desk with a drafting pen and commit felony forgery. And I certainly did not force Patricia to illegally stamp those documents with a backdated state notary seal. You did all of that entirely on your own. Your sheer, unadulterated arrogance laid the foundation, and your staggering greed built the cage. All I did was quietly lock the door behind you. Patricia let out a loud wail, burying her face in her hands. I ignored her entirely, keeping my eyes locked onto Richard. You handed me those forged tax documents and demanded that I fix them. I said, my tone laced with absolute disgust. You demanded that I become an active accomplice in your criminal conspiracy. You expected me to eagerly throw myself onto the train tracks to ensure your favorite child could walk away with a stolen fortune. And when I supposedly left for Chicago, you did not hesitate for a single second to violently discard me. You threw me out of the family the moment you thought Harrison was going to give Madison $1 billion lifestyle. You used me, I stated coldly. You abused my loyalty, you mocked my career, and you fundamentally underestimated my intelligence. You looked at my tailored suits and my spreadsheets, and you saw a weak, passive victim you could manipulate forever. You told me I was just a boring girl who crunches numbers. You were right. And numbers do not lie, Dad. They do not have emotions. They do not have familial loyalty. They do not manipulate, they do not forge signatures, and they absolutely do not care about your tears. The numbers sitting in these red binders are the exact mathematical calculation of your profound stupidity. Richard physically recoiled, collapsing backward into his chair, as if I had physically struck him across the face. His angry facade completely crumbled, leaving nothing but the terrified shell of a broken, defeated old man. I turned my back on him, disgusted by the sight of his cowardice. I looked down at Madison, who was now hyperventilating, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks, staining the lapels of her expensive white designer suit. Harrison is not bluffing, I told her, my voice echoing with finality. I have the federal prosecutor field office on speed dial. I have already drafted the formal submission letter. If you do not sign that settlement agreement and surrender every single stolen dime right now, you will all be sleeping in a holding cell by midnight. I will personally hand over the evidence, and I will gladly testify against you as the lead forensic witness. David, who had remained perfectly silent throughout the entire legal slaughter, finally moved. He picked up a heavy silver pen from the center of the table. He leaned forward and slid the pen across the polished mahogany wood. It stopped exactly 1 inch away from Madison's trembling hand. Sign the paper, Madison. David commanded, his voice devoid of any pity or mercy. Or Claire makes the call. Madison stared at the heavy silver pen as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the polished mahogany. Her entire body shook with violent tremors. She looked desperately at Richard, then at Patricia, silently begging them to intervene, to find a miraculous loophole, to save her from the absolute destruction of her meticulously curated life. But my parents offered nothing. They were paralyzed by their own terror, fully aware that the massive red binders I had placed on the table contained their one-way tickets to a federal penitentiary. They looked away from her, breaking eye contact, abandoning her completely. Madison let out a final broken whimper. She slowly reached out her fingers, wrapping around the cold metal of the pen. With agonizing slowness, she pulled the settlement agreement toward her. She flipped to the final page. Her hand was shaking so severely she could barely grip the instrument. She pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line and signed away everything. She signed away the sprawling Brooklyn townhouse. She signed away her claim to the commercial real estate empire. She signed away the $50,000 monthly alimony demands. And most devastatingly, she signed away full legal and physical custody of her own children, reducing her existence in their lives to heavily monitored 4-hour blocks of supervised visitation. Harrison did not offer a single word of comfort or congratulations. He reached across the table, grabbed the signed document, and smoothly slid it back into his thin manila folder. The mediation was officially over. "You have 24 hours to return the stolen funds and vacate the premises," Harrison stated coldly, standing up and snapping his briefcase shut. "If you fail to meet those deadlines, the criminal referrals will be instantly transmitted." David stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the room without looking back. I picked up my 3 red binders, ignoring the pathetic weeping husks of my family, and followed him out into the hallway. The fallout over the next 30 days was absolute and devastating. David proved to be infinitely more merciful than they deserved, though his mercy was purely strategic. He explicitly ordered Harrison to withhold the massive red binders from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He did not do this out of any lingering affection for the woman who had tried to bankrupt him. He did it solely for his children. He refused to allow them to endure the severe psychological trauma of watching their mother violently dragged out of her home in steel handcuffs and paraded across the evening news. He refused to let them visit their grandparents through thick acrylic glass in a federal visitation room. He chose the quiet, absolute eradication of Madison influence over the loud, explosive spectacle of a highly publicized criminal trial. However, avoiding federal prison did not mean my family escaped the brutal consequences of their staggering greed. The universe has a remarkable way of balancing the scales, and occasionally that balance is accelerated by highly detailed, completely anonymous tips mailed directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I never technically violated David's strict instructions regarding the federal authorities, but the Internal Revenue Service operates independently. 2 weeks after the mediation, a fleet of black government vehicles arrived unannounced at my parents' suburban home. The anonymous tip had directed them precisely to the backdated ledger entries and the fraudulent notary logs Patricia had so clumsily maintained. The massive forensic audit froze every single one of their financial assets overnight. The sudden appearance of federal tax agents sparked an immediate, uncontrollable wildfire of gossip within their elite social circles. In the ruthless hierarchy of high society, financial instability is considered a highly contagious disease. The rumors began as quiet whispers at the country club and rapidly escalated into loud, undeniable facts. Word of the Cayman Islands Shell Company leaked. Whispers of felony forgery and aggressive wire fraud began echoing through the boardrooms of Richard's primary business partners. The reaction was swift and merciless. Within 3 weeks, 2 of his largest investors permanently severed ties, citing vague concerns about ethical liabilities. His country club membership was quietly but firmly revoked by the executive committee. The superficial friends who had eagerly attended Patricia lavish dinner parties suddenly stopped returning her phone calls. They became social pariahs, completely exiled from the luxurious world they had sacrificed their own daughter to maintain. But the most severe collapse belonged entirely to Madison. forced to instantly vacate the sprawling Brooklyn townhouse and entirely stripped of the massive financial support she had arrogantly assumed was her permanent birthright, she crashed violently into the harsh reality of the working class. The stolen $1.5 million had been forcefully wired back to David's operating account, leaving her bank balance practically empty. With zero alimony, zero marketable skills, and a toxic reputation, her options evaporated rapidly. 30 days after sitting in that glass conference room demanding an opulent fortune, Madison signed a lease on a cramped, cheap one-bedroom apartment in a decaying building on the far edge of Queens. The walls were painted a sickening shade of institutional beige, peeling at the corners where the moisture seeped through the cheap drywall. The persistent, overwhelming smell of old cooking grease and stale cigarette smoke hung heavy in the narrow hallways. Her sweeping views of the Manhattan skyline were replaced by a single dirty window overlooking a loud, garbage-filled alleyway where stray cats fought over scraps. There were no imported Italian leather sofas. There were no walk-in closets filled with designer shoes. Her entire existence was reduced to a cheap mattress on the floor and a folding table she bought from a local thrift store. She was completely isolated. Her former wealthy friends abandoned her the moment her credit cards started declining. Her parents, drowning in their own catastrophic federal audit and suffocating social ruin, had absolutely no resources or energy left to save her. She spent her nights sitting alone in the suffocating heat of her tiny apartment, staring blankly at the cracked ceiling, listening to the loud, aggressive arguments of her new neighbors through the paper-thin walls. The absolute silence of her phone was a constant, agonizing reminder of the empire she had burned to the ground. She had gambled her entire life on a foundation of extreme arrogance and criminal greed, and she had lost absolutely everything. While Madison sat rotting in the suffocating heat of her self-made prison, entirely consumed by the bitter reality of her new, impoverished existence, I was sitting in my meticulously organized corner office, overlooking the Manhattan skyline. I was finalizing the quarterly forensic audits for a massive new roster of high-net-worth clients. My professional career had absolutely exploded in the aftermath of the mediation. Word travels incredibly fast in the elite financial circles of the city. The quiet, boring number cruncher was now universally recognized as one of the most ruthless, precise, and highly sought-after financial investigators on the East Coast. My desk phone vibrated, shattering the quiet focus of my office. I glanced at the digital caller ID. It was an unrecognized number, but the area code belonged to the affluent suburban county where my parents lived. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. The immediate sound of hysterical, wet sobbing filled the earpiece. It was Patricia. "Claire, please!" My mother gasped, her voice completely devoid of the haughty, polished arrogance she had weaponized against me my entire life. "Please do not hang up the phone. We are completely drowning. The federal tax agents froze our primary checking accounts this morning. Your father cannot make payroll for his remaining employees. The legal fees for our defense attorneys are utterly astronomical, and they are demanding a massive retainer to keep us out of federal prison. We need a loan, Claire, just a temporary loan. Just enough to keep the house from going into immediate foreclosure. You have the money now. We know your firm is booming. We are your blood. You have to help us. Family forgives, Claire. Family always forgives." I listened to her pathetic, desperate rambling for exactly 30 seconds. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic leather chair, waiting for a familiar pang of guilt or a rush of daughterly obligation to hit my chest. Nothing came. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The emotional leverage she had aggressively used to manipulate me for 3 decades was completely eradicated. I realized I was listening to the voice of a total stranger. "You do not have a family." "Patricia," I replied, my voice steady, cold, and completely devoid of emotion. "You had a transactional enterprise, and it went permanently bankrupt the exact moment you decided to commit federal fraud to steal $1 million from a good man. You gambled your entire life on a golden child who turned out to be a criminal, and you lost. Do not ever call this number again." I placed the receiver down gently, severing the connection. I opened my phone settings, added her new burner number to my permanent block list, and definitively closed the heavy iron door on the toxic people who had actively tried to destroy me. Exactly 1 year later, the harsh, sterile atmosphere of that Manhattan conference room felt like a distant, irrelevant nightmare. The heavy oak dining table in David's sprawling Brooklyn townhouse was overflowing with massive platters of roasted chicken bowls of steaming pasta and the loud, chaotic laughter of his 2 children. The heavy, suffocating tension that used to choke the air when Madison lived in this house was completely gone. The home finally felt light, warm, and genuinely happy. David sat at the head of the table looking 5 years younger, completely free from the parasitic influence that had tried to drain his life and steal his children. The harrowing narrative of Claire Madison and their parents serves as a stark reminder of a deeply uncomfortable truth: blood does not automatically equate to family. Society often weaponizes the concept of familial obligation, using it as a blanket excuse to demand unconditional loyalty, even in the face of profound abuse, manipulation, and betrayal. In the story, Claire's biological parents and sister viewed her not as a loved one, but as a transactional asset. They saw her merely as a pawn to be discarded or exploited to serve their selfish needs and criminal greed. They fully expected her to compromise her integrity, her career, and her freedom simply because they shared a bloodline. This toxic entitlement perfectly highlights the danger of obligatory loyalty. When a relationship is built on a foundation of narcissistic exploitation rather than mutual respect, the family label becomes nothing more than a dangerous trap designed to keep the victim compliant and silent. The most powerful lesson to extract from Claire's ultimate triumph is the realization that setting permanent ironclad boundaries against toxic relatives is an act of profound self-preservation, not a moral failure. True family is actively chosen. It is found in the people who offer genuine protection, respect, and unwavering support when the facade of the biological family completely crumbles. Walking away from those who fundamentally disrespect you is the first necessary step toward building a life rooted in authentic love and security. We must stop romanticizing the idea that we are forever indebted to our abusers just because we share a last name. Evaluate the relationships in your life today and boldly choose to invest only in the people who actively protect and uplift your peace.